Okay, so let's go ahead and jump to the election of 1860, the image of the election of 1860 with the electoral votes, which I'll post on Blackboard. Note that Texas only has 4 electoral votes in 1860. The population of Texas, which by 1860 there were just under 200,000 slaves in Texas, but its population is still pretty small. Louisiana has more electoral votes, but you know what? That's probably a little bit too much in the weeds. So what happens in 1860? Here's what happens. Abraham Lincoln is the dark horse. He's the long shot candidate for the Republican Party. And remember, the Republicans had done very well in 1856. And they knew that they only had to win a couple more states in 1860 that they'd won in 1856, and they'd win the election because, again, the demographics of the South are working against the South because the North has a far greater population than does the South. So so for instance, the Democrats had won Pennsylvania in 1856, and if the Republicans can win Pennsylvania in 1860 and win Illinois in 1860, they're going to win and keep the other states that they'd won in 1856. They're going to win the presidency. Well, guess who's from Illinois? Abraham Lincoln, right? He'd gained a national stature in 1858 by running against Stephen Douglas. He continued, he traveled throughout the North after 1858, after his defeat. His defeat didn't tarnish him in any way. No one really thought that Lincoln was going to defeat Douglas, but the Lincoln Douglas debates and Lincoln's discussion of how Douglas was opening up, and people like Douglas, Northern Democrats, were opening up the United States to becoming a slave society. They had resonated among many white Northerners. And so Lincoln, he goes to New York, he gives a speech in New York, and he gives a very famous speech at Cooper Union in New York. Anyway, he's a national figure. But in 1860, the Republican that is the leading candidate is a guy named William Seward, and we'll run into William Seward later. He becomes Lincoln's Secretary of State, and he's quite brilliant, very effective as Lincoln's Secretary of State. Seward, very briefly, another Whig turned Democrat, very powerful and prominent in New York State politics. He'd been senator from New York for a number of years. But the problem with Seward is that he seemed a little bit too radical. Where Lincoln had said, a house divided against itself cannot stand, which is, that's kind of ambiguous. What Seward said in the 1850s is that there was an irrepressible conflict between North and South. And that just seemed a little bit more radical, the irrepressible conflict, than Lincoln's much more kind of poetic and ambiguous, a house divided against itself cannot stand. So Lincoln comes across as the more moderate Republican candidate. And so the other thing is that the convention in 1860, the Republican convention in 1860, it's held in Illinois, which is Lincoln has a home field advantage. It's held in Chicago. And so that is a major advantage for Lincoln, because Lincoln, as I said before, is a very polished politician. He's got deep roots in Illinois. He's got a very experienced team around him. Lincoln knows what he's doing. His team knows what they're doing as well. They do something which I always thought was really funny. Lincoln and Seward, in those days, the candidates didn't show up at their conventions. They had their representatives there. But when the votes started, and there were a number of votes for the nomination, what Lincoln's people did is they gave out a number of counterfeit tickets to Lincoln supporters, or people that they had paid. And so the public galleries in the building where the convention was, it was filled with Lincoln supporters, whereas Seward supporters, who had the genuine tickets, they couldn't get in because of the counterfeit tickets, and Lincoln's people had gotten there first. So it kind of seemed to build up this momentum for Lincoln. And there's a bunch of very, very interesting stories about how Lincoln gets the nomination. Long story short, Lincoln's nominated as president on the Republican ticket. Seward swallows hard, but ultimately serves Lincoln quite faithfully as his Secretary of State. So Lincoln, and of course, one of the pluses that Lincoln had, he's seen as moderate on slavery, and he's from Illinois, and Illinois is a state that the Republican Party needs. The Republican Party already had New York in the back. So there were other factors working in Lincoln's direction, but his people basically outsmarted Seward's people and outmaneuvered them. So who does Lincoln run against in 1860? Well, the Democratic Party just shatters by 1860. And the Democratic Party ends up running, or the Lincoln faces four different candidates in 1860. He faces our old buddy Stephen Douglas from Illinois, who Lincoln had just defeated. Douglas had just defeated Lincoln in Illinois in 1858. But Douglas, he is running against Lincoln. And Douglas, though, has alienated a number of his allies in the Democratic Party because Lincoln had tricked him, had maneuvered him into a corner. And I'll talk about that for a second. In 1858, Lincoln lands some shots against Douglas over the question of popular sovereignty, whether or not the people of a territory could vote on whether or not slavery could exist in the territory or not. And Douglas very much had pushed for this idea of popular sovereignty, but he never said, look, in his mind, he thought that, for instance, the folks in Kansas would vote against slavery, but he never said that. That was just his assumption. Well, what Lincoln forces Douglas to do in 1858 is to declare that Douglas considers popular sovereignty a way to stop the expansion of slavery. It's called the Freeport Doctrine. You don't have to remember that. There's a little bit in the weeds. Douglas said that at one of the debates in Freeport, Illinois. But so what Lincoln maneuvers Douglas into saying is that Douglas's notion of popular sovereignty, and again, this idea that the people of the voters of a territory or state would decide on the future of slavery. This is the idea that Douglas used to replace the Missouri Compromise line. He replaced it with this notion of popular sovereignty. And Lincoln maneuvers Douglas into saying, hey, I think popular sovereignty will actually be the end of slavery because the people of a territory can vote against slavery. Well, Southerners were not happy with Douglas when he said that in 1858. So he loses a lot of support in the South when he enunciates the so-called Freeport Doctrine that popular sovereignty could be used to end slavery. But Douglas is wounded. He still runs for president. You know what? I'm not going to bore you with all the people that ran for president. A guy named Breckinridge, who was, I guess I am going to bore you, right? Who was Buchanan's vice president. He ran, the Democratic Party actually splits in two. So Breckinridge runs is kind of a representative of the Southern Democratic Party. Douglas runs as a representative of the Northern Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party, which had been a national party, it cracks in two in the 1860 election. And you've got Douglas running a campaign in the North as a Democrat, and this guy Breckinridge running a campaign in the South as a Democrat. You've got another guy by the name of John Bell, and this is way in the weeds. He's just kind of running his own independent campaign, he's a moderate trying to avert a war. I think I said that 4 people ran against Lincoln. I was wrong. 3 people ran against Lincoln. Douglas, Breckinridge, and this guy Bell. Ultimately, Lincoln wins the election. He wins the election with 39% of the total popular vote, which is incredible if you think about it. Lincoln becomes president with 39% of the popular vote, but he wins the Electoral College pretty easily because he sweeps the North. And again, I've been developing this idea in the last couple of podcasts, how the South is losing the demographic battle. And this is the stark indication. Abraham Lincoln becomes president by winning northern states. And he not only doesn't win any electoral votes in southern states, in some southern states, he doesn't win any popular votes as well. So Lincoln gains the presidency with 39% of the vote, but he wins the Electoral College fairly easily. Douglas and Breckinridge, they split the other votes, but even if you combined their totals, they wouldn't have won the presidency. And this guy Bell took some electoral votes as well. So what we have here is Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency with just votes from the North, with only 39% of the popular vote, but a very, very clear victory in the Electoral College because the population in the North is so much greater than the population in the South. So I'll talk about what a revolution Lincoln's victory was, but let me just leave you with this in this particular week's podcast. Remember, I had said that almost every president except for John Adams and John Quincy Adams had either been a slave owner or supporter of slavery. Abraham Lincoln, although he's a gradualist, he doesn't want to end slavery immediately. He just wants to contain it. He does want to kill slavery. He is an abolitionist. And when he takes over the presidency, this is a shock to Southerners. You have an avowedly anti-slavery Republican who'd won the presidency with a minority of the vote, who now will be appointing Supreme Court justices. What the South realizes in 1860 is they've lost the numbers game. That it will be very, very difficult for slaveholders now to ever elect a president. And if you can't elect a president, you don't control the Supreme Court, even though, of course, that takes time to play itself out. So the election of Abraham Lincoln, a moderate abolitionist, was an incredible shock to the system of the South. And of course, as we know, it is the factor that causes by early 1861 7 southern states to leave the Union, and more are going to join.